General Motors didn't just shut down a factory, they opened a wound Canadians had seen too many times before. On October 21st, 2012, GM quietly announced something that shook an entire community to its core: the permanent closure of the Bright Drop plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. No slow fade out, no transition plan, no new model pipeline, just a blunt, final message: it's over. For more than 1,000 families, this wasn't some corporate restructuring. This was a catastrophe. Over 1,200 workers suddenly lost the stability they had trusted for years. People who had spent a decade or more on the production line woke up to mortgages without income, health care without certainty, pensions without guarantees. One single mother who had worked more than 12 years at the plant suddenly had to wonder how she would tell her kids that everything was changing again because of a decision made hundreds of miles away in Detroit. The betrayal hurt, even more because Canada had believed GM. Only a few years earlier, the company promised to turn that plant into a proud cornerstone of Canada's electric vehicle future. They called it a new era of manufacturing. And Canada answered. Ontario poured in billions. Ottawa followed. This was supposed to be the moment Canada proved it didn't need the U.S. to build high-tech industries. GM gladly took every dollar, every tax incentive, every headline spotlighting their commitment, and then silence. First, GM blamed weaker demand, then a temporary pause, then reduced output, then nothing. When 2025 arrived, production didn't restart as promised. The layoffs became permanent. GM workers weren't just abandoned, they were erased from the company's priorities. For months, GM said nothing publicly, hoping Canada would accept the situation the way governments everywhere have been trained to, quietly, politely, and with no real fight. But this time, Canada didn't respond the way corporations expected, because only 3 days later something happened that GM never anticipated, and it would send shockwaves all the way to Detroit. And what happened next showed the world that Canada was done playing the old game. Canada did not lash out emotionally. It didn't hold a press conference begging GM to reconsider. It didn't scramble to offer more subsidies. It didn't panic. Instead, the government made a move so cold, so calculated, and so strategically devastating that auto executives across North America realized something had changed. 3 days after GM's closure announcement, Industry Minister Melanie Joly and Finance Minister François Champagne issued a short, almost sterile statement. No raised voices, no anger, just a legal dagger hidden inside diplomatic language. The decisions of both companies go against their commitments to Canada and Canadian workers. To the public, those were just words. But inside the industry, that statement meant something entirely different. Canada was activating a weapon GM knew existed, but never thought Canada would use. Months earlier, the government had quietly built a trade enforcement tool called the Auto Remission Framework, and its rules were brutally simple. Build in Canada, you get tariff-free imports. Break your commitments, you lose access to tariff-free imports. Lose access, every US-made car you bring in gets hit with a 25% tariff. GM had broken its promise, so Canada pulled the trigger. In an instant, Canada slashed nearly 25% of GM's duty-free import quota. That meant every US-made GM vehicle, every SUV, every truck, every crossover would now arrive in Canada with a massive 25% penalty attached, and the effects were immediate. Dealers calculated the new numbers. Supply chain managers panicked. And Detroit finally woke up to the reality that Canada wasn't bluffing. But this was only the beginning, because Joly's next move would redefine the entire automotive relationship between Canada and the United States. GM expected political outrage, maybe angry speeches, maybe a symbolic boycott. They did not expect a mathematical knockout. Canada didn't just slap GM's wrist, it struck at the company's financial bloodstream. With one tariff adjustment, the cost of importing a $45,000 Chevy or GMC from the US jumped to over $56,000. No dealer can absorb that. No customer will pay that. And GM dealerships across multiple states, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, suddenly had to rethink their entire inventory strategy. But GM wasn't alone. Stellantis, already on thin ice, got hit even harder. The company's tariff-free import quota was cut by 50%. They were warned that legal action would follow if they failed to maintain their Canadian commitments. For the first time, Canada wasn't politely asking US companies to respect their deals. It was enforcing them. American-made GM vehicles suddenly faced penalties. European imports, normal tariffs. Japanese competitors, normal tariffs. Only GM, the company that broke its promise, felt the full weight of the consequences. This wasn't a trade dispute. This was a government saying, you took our money, you broke your word, now pay the price. And when GM executives saw the financial projections for the next quarter, panic set in instantly. But Joly wasn't done. Her next move showed that this wasn't just about punishing GM. This was about rewriting the rules of power in North America. For decades, U.S. automakers operated with one assumption: Canada won't push back. They believed Canada had no leverage. But now GM saw that belief crumble in real time. After the tariff shock, Melanie Joly met with GM leadership and gave them a message they had never heard from Ottawa before. You have 15 days to present a real plan for a new vehicle at the Ingersoll plant. Not a proposal, not a suggestion, a binding plan with dates, with production schedules, with commitments. GM realized instantly that the rules had changed. This wasn't a negotiation, this was enforcement. If they didn't present a new model to build in Canada, the tariff penalties would become permanent, a long-term financial nightmare. And the panic spread. Ford began reviewing its Canadian strategy. Stellantis replaced its Canadian CEO entirely. Auto executives across Detroit restarted conversations with Ottawa, trying to understand what else Canada could do under this new policy. For the first time in decades, corporations realized something uncomfortable. Canada wasn't afraid of losing them anymore. Workers saw a government willing to fight. Companies saw consequences. And Detroit saw something truly alarming, a government that understood its leverage and was ready to use it. But to understand why this moment was historic, you have to look back at the old system, the system companies relied on for decades. For over half a century, Canadian workers lived under a shadow created by American corporations. It was a simple threat, but it worked every time. If you don't accept lower wages, we'll relocate. If you don't agree to weaker benefits, we'll move production. If you don't offer more subsidies, we'll shut down the plant. And time after time, Canada gave in. Governments bent over backward to keep American companies happy. Tax breaks, special incentives, guaranteed subsidies, even promises to change regulations. The unspoken rule was simple: Canada needs the companies. The companies don't need Canada. GM understood that better than anyone. The company perfected the strategy. Commit to jobs, take subsidies, delay investments, then quietly leave when something cheaper pops up. Workers suffered, communities crumbled, governments felt powerless, until now, because in 2025, Canada didn't collapse under the pressure. It didn't negotiate. From fear, it didn't approach GM with trembling hands. Instead, Canada flipped the entire script. And the change wasn't fueled by outrage. It was fueled by something far stronger, a structural, strategic, legal framework designed to shift the balance of power. And that framework would send a message no corporation expected. Here's what made Melanie Joly's move different from every government reaction before it. It wasn't political, it wasn't improvised, it wasn't symbolic, it was structural. The auto remission framework was built months earlier, quietly, methodically, and with a clear purpose to hold corporations accountable without needing a political fight each time. That meant no shouting, no threats, no messy negotiations, no begging companies to stay, just rules, enforceable rules, the kind that companies can't talk their way out of. Break your commitment, tariffs activate automatically. Respect your commitment, benefits remain. Simple, predictable, brutal. Corporations hate uncertainty more than taxes. And for the first time, Canada wasn't the uncertain party. The companies were. Executives realized that their old strategies, delay, stall, manipulate, wouldn't work anymore because Canada had built a system where the consequences weren't emotional reactions. They were built-in outcomes. The real shock wasn't the tariff. The real shock was the message. Canada finally knows its leverage. And that message traveled fast across boardrooms worldwide. But perhaps the biggest impact wasn't on GM or Stellantis. It was on the entire global auto industry watching this unfold. Within 3 weeks, the math forced Detroit to react. Ford paused all future planning. Stellantis fired and replaced its Canadian CEO. GM quietly sent representatives to Ontario, asking for meetings they had ignored for months. Supply chain directors started recalculating costs. Dealers prepared for potential shortages because they all realized a hard truth. Canada's retaliation wasn't temporary, it was precedent, and the world noticed. Boeing, studying expansion options, suddenly realized Canada was now a country where commitments matter. Intel watched closely, wondering how strictly Canada might enforce manufacturing promises. Pharmaceutical giants, often used to renegotiating deals after receiving subsidies, noticed that Canada had become a jurisdiction where breaking your word comes with guaranteed penalties. Serious companies, the ones that value stable and predictable rules, actually saw Canada becoming more attractive. Exploitative companies, the ones that rely on loopholes and threats, began to worry. In one stroke, Canada did something almost unheard of in North American economic history. It made companies understand that access to Canadian markets came with conditions, and those conditions were enforceable. GM's panic wasn't an accident. It was a lesson, a message, a warning shot. And that message set the stage for something even bigger, a new definition of sovereignty that Canada had never embraced so openly. For generations, Canada was treated as a resource colony for the American auto industry, a place for cheap labor, cheap assembly, and polite compliance. But when GM collapsed its commitments, Canada didn't bow. It didn't back down. It didn't freeze in fear. Instead, Canada used its own economic power, tariffs, frameworks, legal levers, and proved something people didn't expect. Canada doesn't need to beg multinational corporations anymore. It can hold them to their word. For the workers in Ingersoll, this moment was bigger than one factory. It was the first sign of a government willing to use real power, not just speeches, to defend the people who built the country's manufacturing backbone. For companies worldwide, the message was just as clear. Canada has rules now. You follow them, or you face consequences. Automatic, structural, non-negotiable. The next 15 days will reveal GM's decision. Either they submit a real concrete plan with production numbers, timelines, and commitments, or the tariffs remain permanently. And if GM refuses, then Canada will make the penalties permanent, proving to every multinational corporation on the planet that commitments to Canadians are not optional anymore. This isn't just policy. This is sovereignty. This is power. This is what a country looks like when it finally decides that workers matter more than corporate excuses.